Hi, my name's Benedict. Just a little sort of interim video. If anybody's read my Facebook for the day, I've had a most intriguing couple of days. It's just sort of one horrible little moment after another, but I think that's all sort of settling now. Some people wanted off the bus, and I think I never hold anyone on the bus who doesn't want to be on the bus. I think it's really important to only have people on who want to be on. I know I may be an unusual person. I may do things differently, such is the nature of, well, unique individuals. And okay, I'm going to floop the A card. If you're autistic, you will do things differently, and some people, whatever, they take it personally because it's not the choices they've made, which is absolutely fine until they get narky about it, but I don't tolerate that much. And yes, it does mean that sometimes it's time for people to hop off the bus, which has happened, and that all seems to be settled for the day, so that's good. Rather than starting a mix, because I do have a fairly new client, there's one mix down there already, and the next mix I am really eager to do. It's a cover of a song, well, for me, anyone my age, super well known. Younger people perhaps not so much, but really keen to get into that. But whilst the world was on the interesting side, I thought it was better not to do it. And I have been playing around with the kHS stuff that I got, and I also just did a massive review of Tokyo Dawn Labs TDR Nova, the dynamic EQ. I finally really sort of worked out why I was funny with that. I won't go into that because it's in the review, and I was like, wow, this is actually really rather cool. But because I had all that kHS stuff, I'm looking at the EQ, which I really like, the slice, and sort of going, it doesn't do the dynamic thing. I love having this one tool that does absolutely everything I could want it to do. Rather than having to have 12 tools, if I can have one tool that does everything I want it to do, that's a happy Benedict. I spent some time within their own environment trying to work out how to create a dynamic EQ sort of situation. Couldn't really get there. I could get a single band, or I could get up to 2 bands, but it was hard to control. I'm not going to say that what I've made isn't a little hard to control as well, but it felt like it wasn't such a great solution. But that combination of the kHS thing combined with the Reason thing, particularly the Combinator 2 thing, brilliant. So I have made a dynamic EQ without. It's not so much a sound thing, it's just a function thing. So it's split into 5 bands because I've used multipass to solve this. And the solution actually had come to me already, but I hadn't stopped to think how to do it. I kept thinking in the wrong direction. But once I stopped and thought about it, it became obvious, because I realized this whilst I was doing the Nova thing, is that people will mistake a dynamic EQ for a multi-band compressor. And they're not the same, but essentially a good dynamic EQ should have essentially a multi-band compressor behind it. So split the world into X number of bands, and then have a compressor on each to get your dynamics information, to get your gain reduction, your woohooishness, and feed that forward to control the more or less knob of your EQ. So it's almost 2 devices inside the one box, but you can't see one of the devices. You just see the EQ, but behind there's this multi-band compressor thing that, rather than controlling the band levels, which is kind of weird, no, it's not a fan, it takes that information, the gain reduction information, and pushes it forward, as I said, to control the boost cut knob in the way that you're used to it. So I worked it out. If I do exactly that, if I take my signal, don't worry about all the wiring, so my signal comes in to the combinator from subtractor here, it's fed to a splitter. The splitter sends one instance of the signal to a multipass that then uses the separate arts. Took me a little while to find the separate art mode, but uses the separate arts, and then each one of those goes to a dead-headed compressor. So I've got 5 compressors in a row here, each just working on the band that they are being fed. It's driving a little. Now those bands can be controlled from the front panel, which is, I admit, going to be a little less than ideal, because with a Nova, you just use your EQ and it's working on the bands in the background. The multi-band compressor is being worked in the blind. But nonetheless, we can set those bands, set our frequencies. I have got them independent. I thought about trying to slave them to one knob, but they become too complex. They're going to be wrong anyway, no matter which way I look at it, so I might as well make it unique. So we split, and each of these bands is outputting itself to a compressor, which is deadheaded, as in there is nothing that comes out of this compressor. I push the gain in real heavy, I push the threshold real low. I thought about a higher compressor ratio, but then it gets too twitchy. I don't want this to feel twitchy. Attack and release settings I have just set and forget. Generally, there's a sort of attack and release I seem to use in a multiband. Or sorry, in a dynamic compressor anyway. Then I take the gain reduction information, the CV wiring, and plug them into one of these. Good old beans, robotic beans compare CV scope. I don't use this a lot, but when I find the right use for it, it's like, yeah, it's one of those tools that you've got no use for until you've got it, and then you're like, oh, that's cool, that'll do these things. And it can do a lot more than I sort of think, and I should pull it forward more often. Nonetheless, so the reduction information is fed in. Now this has got 4 slots, so there's 1 down here. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and then number 1 down here is 5. So that's showing the CV gain reduction that's hitting each of these channels. On the front, I can turn each of these channels off. So that's the mute button here. I can use the offset, which ends up being my boost or cut for the EQ, and then I can use the thing that sends the signal up or down, and that gives me a dynamic EQ. I've also got a shape here which controls the cutoff shape of the EQ, which we will see a little bit later, but this I thought was just super. The one device that allows me to do 3 things at once. That's good math in Benedict's book. And then the last knob we see up here is the Q width. And of course, that all goes to a slice EQ. So this EQ gets its signal not via the multiband, blah, 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 or any kind of compressor. It is getting its signal straight from that split. One split goes to the multiband and all the deadhead compressors, and the other split comes pure to here. Woohoo, you can dance! I can actually have this off, it's not relevant. And then I can adjust, let's close this fella up and see if we can get just enough on the screen at once. It's not going to be easy. I guess I should shrinkify this. Nah, that's not going to happen. So, simple EQ. I'm just control clicking to send that right back to to where it belongs. If I've got such desire, I can change the shape of these, meaning that we can have rather cool square bandy splitty things. What I use that for? No idea, but it's kind of cool. I'm looking at another EQ which actually uses that process a little more subtly than that, uses that process to change the way the EQ sounds or feels. I will talk about that when I review that on the high hertz thing. But as we can see, we can have, if we just have the one band for the moment, so it's just a little easier to see. Actually, we'll choose the mid band. That's more little bit more action on it, we can set that to. So it's probably somewhere about minus 15 dB at full throw, and very easy to go positive. I know most people think of dynamic EQ as always being just dropping, but there are times where it's really wonderful, especially across, say, a drum bus or something like that, or even this sound, where you've got one bit goes down, another bit goes up. It's like, ooh. So it is possible to, of course, just set this, but somehow that's a lot thicker in a not such great way as maybe because that's rising and falling, so the thickness is not there all the time. That's it. I can change the frequencies, move them around. For the moment, they're roughly set with the bands, but very roughly. I can move these bands around as I want. They'll be harder to see, of course. It would be nice to be able to pull something on the front to be able to see it, but such is life. But they're independent of each other, so it's all going to be done by feel, which I actually rather like. There is something great about having these sorts of things and going and pulling them around as you do with Nova or various other things. But at the same time, there's something wonderful about feel. So it can be used fully as an eyes-only dynamic EQ, which you can either leave set to be a sort of a graphic EQ, or move things around anywhere from a little bit to a lot. As to how useful I'll find it, remains to be seen. It was just a bit of an exercise to say, well, okay, what's going to happen? And I gotta say, I'm pretty pleased with myself. So where one system may have a limit, and now I've realised I could actually do this if I had a good band splitter in any environment really. I can use the kilohertz one again if there were one in the RE environment, or Reason were kind enough to give us a much more complex band splitter than the one we've got, which only goes to 2. You can make it 2 to 4 to what have you, but it'd be nice to have something a little bit more specialized. There I was using the Air Raid Audio, but last I knew that one, which is a shame because I kind of liked that, but that was only 3. There is something nicer when you get to 5 or whatever. Over 5 would just be hard. This took me a whole afternoon to make. So just there's a way you can actually do a surprising amount of stuff. I now have a unique tool which, while it's built upon several other things, in action it's going to sound unique. And this is a big thing. When I listen to my mixes that I do for clients and what have you, and when they listen to those often, it's sort of like, oh. And it's like, it took me a little while, and then I suddenly started to realise part of the reason for that is because you hear so many mixes where people are just kind of using presets and just using them the way they are. And yes, they pile up lots of devices, and it's nothing against what they get if they end up with a dynamic result, but often they end up with a relatively same result, whereas I tend to end up with an unusual sound in my mixes, in part because the tools that I'm using are unique as well. So, proof of concept, how much it gets used, don't know, but yes, I was asking the question in the kilohertz group. Now I can actually show you. While I don't know how possible it is just within the kilohertz environment alone, but combining kilohertz environment, particularly their multipass, with the Reason environment, rather groovy, dynamic EQ, totally doable. You have fun now.